Dr. Strassman, how does one come to be a doctor who studies DMT in a country where it's one of the most prohibited substances of anything out there?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to not tell anybody that you want to become a doctor to give people DMT. That's what I did. Or I kind of began by telling people as an undergraduate when I was applying to medical schools that that's the sort of work I wanted to do. And of the 20 medical schools I applied to, I told 18 of them that's what I wanted to do, and I didn't get into those 18. And the two that I was not given the opportunity to put my foot in my mouth, I got into those two schools. And once I started medical school, it became clear that this was not an area of interest of any of the people that I was working with or any of my instructors. This was in the this was in the early 1970s. So I just went through my medical school training. Actually, I dropped out of medical school after a year because I became, so depressed with the prospect of doing any hallucinogen research. And I actually, at that point, began my interest in Zen Buddhism, just because I was kind of losing my mind and needed to get my feet back on the ground. Carry water, chop wood, whatever. So I spent some time at a Zen monastery, kind of learned to just keep to myself in a way, keep some of my crazier ideas to myself, and just went back to medical school and learned as much as I could. But still, I was keeping in the back of my mind that this is the field I want to pursue, and once I have the opportunity to, I'm going to. So I completed med school and did my residency, and then my first clinical job was up in Alaska, where there was a lot of winter depression, and it was around that time that the biology of winter depression began being explicated with respect to the pineal gland and melatonin. So that seemed like a fortuitous combination of circumstances. So I returned to school and I took a fellowship in clinical psychopharmacology and learned how to do research and learned about the pineal. At the time, in the early 80s, there wasn't that much known about melatonin. So I then got a job at the University of New Mexico because there was an endocrinologist there that was interested in the effects of melatonin on puberty, which is an important aspect of melatonin. And I still was keeping my deeper motivations to myself and was really curious as to are there any psychedelic responses to melatonin in humans. So we performed an exhaustive study on the function of melatonin, and it turned out it was not psychedelic. One thing about the pineal is I've gotten in a lot of hot water because people have taken as gospel truth, that the pineal makes DMT, but it's not true. It's unknown. We still don't know. In the book, I marshal a fair bit of circumstantial evidence. Supporting some kind of connection between DMT and the pineal, but we still don't know. I have a colleague at Louisiana State University who's developing a new way of measuring DMT in blood and human tissues, and I think within a year it'll become clear if the pineal makes DMT, but we still don't know. In any event, after completing the melatonin study and determining that the melatonin wasn't psychedelic, in the meantime I had learned about DMT and thought, I'll just go for the gusto, and it's about time. I've been trained, I've published papers, I've gotten grants, so I felt like I was in a good position to start looking at DMT. So this was in the this was in the late 1980s. So I stopped the melatonin research and started a 2-year process to get permission to give people DMT. It was the first such study in the U.S. in a very long time. And I wrote a descriptive paper about how to go through the maze of bureaucracy and all these boards and so on.
Work around the red tape?
To work through the red tape. Yeah, I couldn't work around it, but I had to work through it. Yeah, so there were local boards and committees, there were state boards and committees, and so the two, major hurdles were the federal boards, the FDA and the DEA. But I just, kept a sober approach. I wasn't making any extravagant claims about DMT. I just was sort of interested in, characterizing its effects. Especially in the context of all of, the preclinical, kind of basic science information which had been accumulated about these compounds in lower animals over the intervening 20 years. So it was just a study to give people various doses of DMT and, determine the biological and, the psychological effects. So that was a hard study, to refute. Like, I wasn't really talking about spiritual effects or psychotherapeutic effects. So it was, in a way, a, matter of just, satisfying the requirements for safety. And so I recruited only experienced, psychedelic users. I screened people very carefully. So just established all of the safeguards that, that those regulatory agencies were interested in seeing occur.
How did you get who synthesized it for you, and how did you get the samples for the study?
I had gotten substantial grant awards, to do the study, even, before beginning, even before getting any DMT. Which was sort of a curious phenomena. But I had convinced the Scottish Rite Foundation, which is a branch of the Masons actually, to fund the study. And I got a grant from them and then started, all along I was, working, to locate someone to make the DMT for me. So, I, kind of looked everywhere, extracting it or even purifying old, DMT on the shelf at the National Institute of Drug Abuse, all and every possibility. So the person who ultimately made the drug for me is Dave Nichols at Purdue for $300. 5 grams of the purest DMT ever made. Yeah, so that was a gift from Dave.
So, as far as definitions, how would you define dimethyltryptamine?
Well, so DMT is, it's a chemical cousin, as it were, of the neurotransmitter serotonin. And it's also closely related to the and it's also closely related to melatonin in structure. It's a very small compound. It's not much larger than glucose. And it occurs in a huge variety of plants, and it's also a compound which is made endogenously in every mammal that's been studied, including humans. The gene which is responsible for the enzyme which is responsible for the final step in the synthesis of DMT has been isolated in the human being and cloned. So it's quite well characterized. So the organ that seems responsible for the majority of synthesis of DMT is the lungs, and so that's an interesting finding with respect to the relationship of spirit and breath and all those kinds of connections that have been made over the millennia.
Why did you subtitle your book "The Spirit Molecule"?
Well, as Alex has quipped, it's kind of the ultimate paradox. It's both spiritual and material at the same time. It's, kind of like the most spiritual of the material and the most material of the spiritual. So it's kind of establishing a bridge, between the two realms, as it were, which I don't think are actually, separated, but, conceptually and experientially, they seem to be. So DMT kind of provides a link, I would say, between the spiritual and material.
Would you call it a coincidentia oppositorum, a union of opposites?
I would say the confluence of opposites, or the rubbing of shoulders of opposites, I suppose. It isn't a union, really. I suppose ineluctability might be a good word too.
How did you come to choose the cover for your book?
Well, I spoke to Alex and I said, that is what people look like when they're getting a big dose of DMT. And I said, could I use that for the cover? And he said, I would love it. Yeah, it's a very strange thing to give a really large dose of intravenous DMT. It isn't practical to give a smoked compound on a research unit, so we decided to give it intravenously. And people are just lying there stock still. Their blood pressure is really going quite high, but on the other hand, they're completely oblivious to what's going on around them. And they look a little pale and a little clammy, and you can just kind of see their spirit leaving them. And it's very quiet in the room. It's very eerie on the ward, and this all is taking place within the first couple of minutes. And you're just praying that they're all right. You have no idea what's going on, and it is as if their spirit has left their body. So I thought, well, this would be an extremely good image to put on the cover. Some people have complained, well, that's a really spooky cover, turns people off. You might get more readers if it was a more benign cover. But I thought, well, this cover represents the trip, and come what may.